Good morning, everyone. I hope you know you're special before you enter those school doors.
Mr. James, how do you remember every single student's name after all these years?
Because every child deserves to know someone sees
For
them.
25 years, James Carter stood at the same corner outside Lincoln Elementary School. Every morning, before the first school bell rang, he was already there. Rain or sunshine, cold winter mornings or hot summer afternoons. With his bright safety vest, his stop sign, and his warm smile, James became a familiar face that every child in the neighborhood knew. But James was different from any other crossing guard. He didn't just help children cross the street. He remembered them. He remembered the little boy who always wore the same blue backpack. He remembered the girl who used to cry every Monday morning because she missed her mother. He remembered the quiet students who needed someone to encourage them. Some parents couldn't believe it. "Mr. James, how do you remember so many names?" one parent asked him. James smiled and simply replied, "Because names matter." To most people, he was just the man standing on the corner every morning. But to the children, he was much more than that. He was the person who noticed when they were having a bad day. He was the person who celebrated their small victories. He was the person who made them feel like they mattered. For 25 years, James gave his time, his energy, and his heart to those children. But what nobody knew was that behind his gentle smile was a story filled with sacrifice, loss, and a promise that changed the way he looked at every child who walked past him. And one morning, after 25 years of showing up for everyone else, James discovered that the people he had spent years caring for had something planned for him that he never saw coming. Stay with me as I share the full story of the man who spent 25 years remembering every child's name. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The next morning started like every other morning. Before the sun fully rose, James Carter was already standing at the familiar corner outside Lincoln Elementary School. He adjusted his reflective vest, picked up his stop sign, and looked down the street as the first few families began arriving. "Good morning, Mr. James," a group of children shouted as they walked toward him. James smiled. "Good morning, everyone. Ready to have a great day?" The children smiled back. For most people, that moment would seem ordinary. But for James, those small greetings were the reason he continued showing up every single day. He knew that children remembered how adults made them feel, and he wanted every child who crossed that street to feel important. Over the years, many things had changed around the school. The buildings had been renovated. New teachers had arrived. And new generations of children had come and gone. But one thing remained the same. James Carter was still standing at that corner. One afternoon, after the students had gone home, a young teacher named Sarah walked toward him. She had only worked at the school for 3 years, but she had heard stories about James from almost everyone. "Mr. James, can I ask you something?" James smiled. "Of course. How do you do it?" James looked confused. "Do what?" "Remember everyone. You know every student's name, their families, their personalities. It's like you have some kind of special gift." James laughed softly. "No gift, I just listen." Sarah looked at him carefully. Most people don't even notice children unless they need something from them. James looked toward the empty playground. That's exactly why they need someone who does. Sarah noticed the emotion in his voice. "Was there someone who did that for you when you were younger?" James became quiet. For a moment, he looked back at the school building. Then he slowly nodded. "No." Sarah waited. James took a deep breath. "When I was a child, I knew what it felt like to walk into a room and feel invisible." He explained that growing up, he was often the quiet child nobody paid attention to. Teachers focused on the loud students. Adults noticed the children who caused problems, but the children who struggled silently were often forgotten. And James never forgot that feeling. Years later, when he became a father, he saw that same sadness in his own son. His son was a good kid. He was kind. He was intelligent. But he struggled to believe in himself because he felt like nobody noticed him. James remembered sitting beside his son's bed one night and making a promise. He promised that if he ever had the chance to make a child feel seen, he would never waste that opportunity. That promise followed him for 25 years. Every name he remembered, every smile he gave, every encouraging word, it was all connected to that promise. But what James didn't know was that one of those children he helped years ago had grown up and never forgotten the man who stood at that corner every morning. And after 25 years, that child was finally coming back, not as a student, but with a surprise that would leave James speechless. 2 weeks passed, and James Carter continued his routine. Every morning he stood at the same corner. Every morning he greeted the children by name. Every morning he believed he was simply doing what he promised himself he would do years ago. But something had changed. The teachers seemed to be whispering more than usual. Parents who normally rushed through the crosswalk were stopping to smile at him. Even some former students had started visiting the school more often. James noticed it, but he never imagined the reason. One Friday morning, as James arrived at his usual spot, he saw something unusual. The school parking lot was filled with cars. There were teachers, parents, and many adults he didn't recognize. He looked around in confusion. "What is going on here?" he quietly asked himself. A young woman walked toward him with a big smile. James looked at her face but didn't recognize her. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." James smiled politely. "Good morning, young lady. Have we met before?" The woman laughed softly as tears filled her eyes. "You probably don't remember me." She paused. "But I remember you." James looked surprised. "My name is Olivia." The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "I was one of the children who crossed this street every morning when I was little." James smiled. "Olivia, you were the girl who carried the purple lunchbox." Her eyes widened. "You remember that?" James laughed. "Of course I do. You used to drop it almost every morning." Olivia covered her mouth, emotional. "Mr. Carter, that's exactly why we're here." James looked around at the crowd. "What do you mean?" She turned toward the people standing behind her. Many of them were former students. Some were doctors. Some were teachers. Some were business owners. Some were parents who had brought their own children. But they all shared one memory: the man who stood at the corner every morning and made them feel important. Olivia stepped forward. "For 25 years, you remembered our names." She looked around at the crowd. "You remembered our struggles. You remembered our dreams. You encouraged us when we didn't believe in ourselves." James lowered his eyes. "I was just doing my job." A man from the crowd stepped forward. He was now a successful lawyer, but James recognized him immediately. "You always say that, Mr. Carter." He smiled. "But you don't understand. You weren't just holding a stop sign. You were showing children that they mattered." James stood quietly as emotions overwhelmed him. He looked at all the faces in front of him. People he once saw as children were now grown adults standing before him. And for the first time, James realized something. The small moments he thought nobody noticed had become memories that people carried for decades. But the biggest surprise was still waiting. Because the former students had not gathered just to thank him. They had come together because they wanted to give James something he never expected. James stood quietly in front of the crowd, still trying to understand what was happening. For 25 years, he had been the one giving encouragement. He had been the one making people smile. He had been the one reminding children that they were special. But now, all those people were standing there for him. Olivia stepped forward and held a small box in her hands. "Mr. Carter, we wanted to give you something." James smiled and shook his head. "You all don't have to do anything for me. Seeing you all doing well is already enough." Olivia smiled. That's exactly what you always say. You never think about yourself. She opened the box. Inside was a beautiful watch with a message engraved on the back. James looked at it carefully. The message read, "To the man who made us feel seen." His eyes immediately filled with tears. "I don't know what to say." A former student stepped forward. "You don't have to say anything, Mr. Carter. We just wanted you to know that your kindness followed us long after we left that school." Another former student spoke. "When I was a child, I was going through the hardest time of my life. My parents were separating, and I felt like nobody noticed me." She looked at James. "But every morning, you remembered my name and asked me how I was doing. You made me feel like someone cared." James wiped his eyes. "I had no idea." She smiled. "That's because you never did it for attention." The crowd became silent. Then the lawyer who had spoken earlier stepped forward with a folder. "Mr. Carter, we also have something else for you." James looked confused. "What is that?" The man opened the folder. "For years, you've been standing outside this school, even after retirement age, because you believed children needed you." He paused. "So we decided the person who spent his life taking care of others deserves someone to take care of him too." James looked at the papers. It was a community fund created by former students and parents, a fund that would allow him to finally retire comfortably without worrying about his future. James couldn't believe it. "You all did this?" Olivia nodded. "Yes." "But why?" She smiled. "Because you taught us something important. Kindness is never wasted." James looked around at the crowd. The children he once watched cross the street had become adults who returned to honor him. At that moment, he understood something powerful. The names he remembered were not just names. They were lives. They were stories. They were people who carried his kindness with them wherever they went. But there was one final surprise waiting for James. A surprise connected to the very first child he ever helped cross that street, 25 years ago. The crowd became quiet as Olivia looked toward the back of the group. "Mr. Carter, there is one more person who wanted to be here today." James looked confused. "One more person?" A man slowly walked forward. He was older now, with gray hair and a gentle smile, but James immediately recognized something familiar about him. The man stopped in front of James. "Do you remember me?" James looked carefully at his face. Then his eyes widened. He took a step back. "No way." The man smiled. "My name is Daniel." James placed his hand over his heart. "Daniel?" He remembered. 25 years earlier, Daniel was the first child who ever crossed that street while James was working there. Daniel was a quiet little boy who always walked alone. He carried a small backpack and rarely spoke. Every morning, James would greet him. "Good morning, Daniel. Ready for a great day?" At first, Daniel never answered, but James never stopped saying it. Eventually, Daniel started smiling. Then he started talking. Then he started believing in himself. James looked at the grown man standing in front of him. "I can't believe it's you." Daniel smiled. "I never forgot you, Mr. Carter." He explained that when he was a child, he struggled with confidence. He felt like he wasn't smart enough. He felt like nobody noticed him. But every morning, one person did. "Those few seconds you spent talking to me every day changed my life." James shook his head. "I was just being kind." Daniel smiled. "No, you were planting something in me." He told James that he became a teacher because he wanted to give children the same feeling James gave him. "The reason I became an educator is because of you." James looked around at all the former students. Doctors, teachers, parents, leaders, all people who had been touched by one man's simple decision to care. That day, the community officially named the school crosswalk after James Carter. A small sign was placed near the street. It read, "James Carter Way, a place where every child was seen. James stood there, looking at the sign with tears in his eyes. He never expected recognition. He never expected a celebration. He never expected anyone to remember him. But that was the lesson James had unknowingly taught everyone. The kindness we give today may become the strength someone carries for the rest of their life. Years later, whenever a new student arrived at Lincoln Elementary School, teachers would tell them about the man who once stood at that corner every morning. The man who remembered every name. The man who made every child feel important. Because James Carter proved something the world often forgets. You don't need fame, wealth, or power to change lives. Sometimes, all it takes is a kind word, a caring heart, and the decision to show up for someone every day.